Hey everyone, there are so many different ways to paint metallics on our models for the tabletop. But what if you're relatively new and you've only got a couple of different paint options in the range of metals? So say a couple of silvers, maybe a goldy bronze, and then a couple of other things maybe dotted around. Well, you're in luck because today we're going over 5 different techniques and methods that you can use to paint metallics for a nice tabletop standard. And these are all things that can be combined on top of each other to make different looking metals suitable for your army, whether you're painting fantasy armor and shields or you're painting 40k bolt guns and tank armor. Let's jump in and get painting some metal. The first option we are opting for is going to be an overbrush method. And here we want to start from a black undercoat, which in this case will also be acting as our base coat. So we have a nice black base coat to work from. This means we get the benefit of utilizing this black base in order to maximize the shine on our next steps, where we are going to be starting off with a dark silver and overbrush this across all of the metallic areas, in this case across the shield. Once that has dried, we can then do essentially the same thing, except this time using a slightly lighter silver. But what we want to do this time is focus more on the higher areas and the edges, to give that metal a natural glinting highlight on all of those particular surfaces. And it's as simple as that. This is the nicest and quickest method that we've got in order to get some simple metals on your models. Essentially, overbrushing is very similar to a technique called dry brushing. Here what we're going to be doing is making sure that we've got a decent amount of wet paint in the brush, taking off a fair amount of it, but making sure that when we run the brush over an area, it still deposits a nice, thick, decent layer of paint. Then what we can do is essentially just drag the brush over the areas we want to be overbrushing. This leaves, in this case on the shield, the black in the recesses, and then gives the larger flat planes as well as the edges a nice shine, which will represent the reflectiveness of the metal while giving us that nice darker shadow. Then we have our second method, which is where we're going to be using a base coat over the black on this occasion. But we want to grab a tin bits bronzy tone instead of a silver. Generally, I find the darker the tone here, the better the effect works, but we can work with this lighter bronze that I have available. Once the base coat of this bronze is dry, we want to follow this up with a heavy dry brush using a dark to mild silver. We want to come in and do this dry brush from multiple angles. This will help to pick out all of the main details in silver, but leave bronze in all of the recesses, similar to the overbrushing we did before. Finally, we can then come in and do another round of dry brushing, this time using a lighter silver, aiming to catch all of the edges, and mainly when stroking the model with the brush, aiming to drag it from the closest point to the light source and then moving away, replicating the effect of light hitting the reflective surface and making the closer points brighter. And that gives us a nice aged looking shield that we can use for various different effects. And it's a nice transition from the darker bronzier tone up to the lighter brighter silver. And we can use this in a lot of different ways. We use dry brushing for this one instead of overbrushing, and they are very similar techniques. I even used the same brush, except what I ended up doing was removing a lot more of the paint from the dry brush than I did the overbrush. What this meant is while it did deposit the paint onto the model, it wasn't in large, thick layers, and it more coated it gently over time. So we will need to do more passes with a dry brush than we will with an overbrush, but we get slight more control because we're building it up over thinner layers as opposed to a thick layer in one go. Moving on to method number 3, this method is more of the typical edge highlighting style. And here what we want to do is from the undercoat of black, give the area a nice darker silver base coat. This will mean that we have a nice recessed dark area to work from with the model, as well as being nice and shiny due to going over the black. Once we have this base coat in place and we know it is dry, what we can then do is take the lighter silver we have available and a thin tipped round brush. We can use this to go in and paint the lighter silver along all of the edges of the sharp areas, as well as any sculpted details that might be on the area we're painting silver. This will highlight all of the edges and all of the areas, giving us a nice impression of light glinting off any sharp areas or protruding sections. This method probably requires the most brush control out of all of them because we're actually going in with a thin tip brush and either painting on the edge highlights or catching the edges with our brush. Generally, how I find easiest to edge highlight, if it's not a center detail that we can't catch with the side of our brush, in which case we have to use the tip and it comes down to brush control, I find it's generally easier to make sure that we are using a paint that is semi-thinned so that it flows off of the brush nicely. But we do want to make sure that we remove any excess from the brush so that when we touch it to a model, we don't just flood that entire area with paint. Once we have that ratio and we know that we can pull paint off the brush nicely without destroying the area by flooding it in this new color, what we want to do is come in at roughly a 45-degree angle perpendicular to the section we're highlighting. We can then use the body of the brush and swipe that across that edge, and it will give us a nice thin highlight along that edge where the brush has touched that point. Otherwise, we will need to go in and, as I said, use brush control just to highlight the specific areas with the tip of the brush. But that can be fun and good things to practice with. But because of this, this is probably the one that shows up most as you need to progress and get more skilled with it. So bear that in mind, but we can stack it with a couple of other techniques that we'll be touching on in a moment. And that is options number 4 and 5. And here we are going to be wrapping them together as they are very, very similar in the process. In fact, they are exactly the same, except one of them has an additional step. For these, what we want to do is go over the black undercoat and base coat everything in a light silver. This will help to show off the effects of the next steps a little bit more clearly. What we want to do here, once the silver base coat is completely dry, is apply a wash. This will settle in all of the recesses and across the overall shield, darkening the colour and giving us defined separation lines between all of the elements on the sculpted area. Though when doing this, we do need to be careful in order to mop up any areas that may be too saturated or flooded with this wash. And the easiest way to do that is just to touch the area with a clean brush, and what this will do is wick up any excess wash. When working with washes, there are a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. Obviously, we've already touched on the pooling aspect, where we need to go in and mop up any excessive areas that are flooded with the wash. This is so that we don't end up just destroying any sculpted details, as well as having any unsightly black blobs or whatever color wash we're using, blobs of that color on our areas and bits that we don't particularly like the look of. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing, however, is that when we apply a wash to an area, especially metallics, it will naturally tint and change the tone of the area. With metallics, however, it also tends to dull down the shininess of the paint that we've put down. And this kind of makes sense. We've essentially put a translucenty filtered area, because it's a colored liquid, over our shiny pigments that are in our metal paint. So it's a little bit harder for the light to refract off and then look nice and shiny. And this is where our 5th shield comes in. Up till this point, it's been treated the same way, base coat and a wash. But now what we're going to do is come in and do some edge highlights on the shield. Doing those edge highlights will help to bring back a little bit of the shininess that we lost from applying this wash. And because the wash has also dulled down the original silver color that we've used, that means we can come back in with the same color and highlight it with an edge highlight, giving us a nice balance and shine after we've applied that wash. As you can see from all of these images, each of these methods gives a different outcome in a different way. And we can essentially multiply these and use these in different formations, in different parts across different models, in different armies for our tabletop games. Which means that using just essentially 3 colors and a wash, we've managed to make a varying amount of different ways that we could highlight metals for the tabletop. And all of them are really simple, achievable, and we can get to work painting up models quite happily. The best bit is we can also, once we've learnt these techniques and methods, combine them all on top of each other to push our metals a little bit further, which is how I came up with this last shield, which you'll hopefully be seeing a photo of now. And essentially this is using all of the previous steps that we've kind of gone over here, from a bronzy base coat with some metallic overbrushes, then a wash, highlighted back up using some dry brushing and a final edge highlight. Gives us a really nice shield that would look brilliant for any tabletop model. And it doesn't take that long once you've got the hang of these techniques. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about techniques and the ways that you can paint, you might want to check out this video, because this is where I go over 10 varying techniques that you will often see on places like here, YouTube, my channel, other people's channels. Alternatively, if you want to see using these sorts of techniques and building an army quite quickly and how we can get through, say, a starter set or something like that in a nice quick fashion, you might want to check out this video here where we do just that. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.